Hey, we must be coming down the home stretch to not only this chapter but this unit. We've arrived at the mammals. So they protect their embryos in membranes, amniotes. Mammals are famous for having hair, although in certain examples of reverse evolution, like the cetaceans, whales, and dolphins, and so forth, they've lost their hair. I'm losing my hair too. I must be a whale. And of course, they make milk. So this is called the class Mammalia, more than 5,300 known species, although we add to that list each month, it seems. Let's see, where are we? Oh, yes, at the bottom. Made it. So what defines a mammal? Its derived characteristics are mammary glands, hence the name mammal. That's milk production. Hair. Some mammals are quite hairy, right? Very furry. High metabolic rate. And we talked before about certain reptiles being ectotherms. Well, mammals are endotherms. Again, be a little careful with the term cold-blooded and warm-blooded. Those aren't the best terms to use, but endothermy means it's essentially a form of homeostasis, right? You can maintain a fairly constant internal warm temperature. Larger brain than other invertebrates of equivalent size. So if you put a mammal, let's say a cow, head to head with, I don't know, let's say an alligator, right? Maybe equivalent in weight, more or less. The cow's got a far larger brain. And mammals are famous for anybody going into dental school, famous for having differentiated teeth, right? So part of anatomy, you have to learn all the different types of teeth, the incisors and molars and so forth. So we used this term back in the previous section to distinguish from diapsids. The reptiles, mammals come from what looked like reptiles, except they had an evolutionary structure in their skull that distinguished them from reptiles. So the later synapsids, of course, became mammals, the single hole behind the eye socket in the skull. In evolution of mammals from the early synapsids, two of the bones from the jaw joint actually migrated into the middle ear, interestingly enough. This just illustrates what we're talking about. Um, we can, well, anapsids were early creatures. An means without, so you don't see this hole located here. If you're a diapsid, you see two holes in the skull. This is the eye socket right here. And if you're a synapsid, they've come to get, the word syn means together, right? So they've come together to form a single whole. Lots of people think of Dimetrodon as being a dinosaur, but it's actually not. Dinosaurs, remember, were reptiles, which were your diapsids. So Dimetrodon was a very early synapsid. They still kind of looked like reptiles. So just some extinct synapsids to illustrate the diversity. And in looking through them, you do see some of them look very much like reptiles, although some of them must be more towards the later end of synapsid evolution. They start having some mammalian appearances to them. So once we got to the early Cretaceous period, we see three lineages that gave rise to three living lineages that are still with us, your monotremes. So these are actually going to be considered our basal organisms. They're very transitional. They still show some synapsid in there for some reptilian traits. your marsupials, and your eutherians. So you recognize the word "eu" as true. This word means uterus. So what's true about their uterus? Well, eutherians, those are mammals in which the embryo forms in the uterus. These, the embryo actually is born and has to stay in a pouch for a while until it matures. You see kind of a transition then, very primitive mammals, almost reptilian in some ways, marsupials to your true eutherian mammals. Philadelphia Zoo has some monotremes that you can go visit, or you can watch Perry the Platypus. Remember that show? That's such a good show. So it's a small group of egg-laying mammals. So there's some of the reptilian features. The eggs actually look very much like reptile eggs. So these are your echidnas and your platypus. Here's an echidna, and you can see its egg. It's a kind of a leathery egg, sort of like reptiles lay. The platypus is sometimes called a duckbill platypus. Its snout looks almost bird-like, actually. So we generally associate marsupials with Australia, although there are some American marsupials that would be your opossums. Actually, you want to have those around. They're really good at eating ticks. They come out at night and they hunt for the ticks in your grass. So, they're fairly famous marsupials, right? Your koalas, your kangaroos. So as I say, the embryo initially develops in the uterus, but it's born really early in development. So it's actually born still as an embryo, and it has to complete its development in what we call a pouch. The technical name for the pouch is the marsupium, hence the name marsupial. So you can see this possum is very much looking like an embryo. So in order to survive inside the marsupium are where you find the nipples. So it basically latches on to nurse as it develops. Greater bilby, kangaroo type creature from Australia. That brings us to our eutherians. That's our placental mammals. So these are the most advanced tetrapods now in the evolutionary scale. So they have a more complex placenta. So the young, they complete their embryonic development in the uterus, where they nourish, of course, by way of the placenta. And this ties into what I was saying a little earlier. I'm always amazed at animals, like you watch footage of a giraffe being born, for example, and this poor thing, it basically falls from pretty high. The mother's pretty tall, right? She gives birth standing up, and this thing plops on the ground, and all of a sudden it somehow knows to get up and run around. So we started this chapter with a comment. Let's finish it with the same comment. You don't have to memorize the complex phylogenies. Just have a general sense as to the group, and then some of the representatives in that group. So the basal organisms are these strange mammals that seem to retain some reptilian traits. That's your monotremes. Kind of transitional from the monotremes to the true placental mammals are your marsupials, right? These guys here, this group is called Afrotherians. So you recognize therian as being a mammal. these evolved in Africa. Now they're not strictly found in Africa any longer, but that's a case of adaptive radiation, right? These guys here, your Xenarthra, so they actually evolved in the continents that are now called America. So those are basically strictly American mammals. That's anteaters and aardvarks and stuff. This group here, so this is a fairly challenging word, the Euarchontogliers. And really what that means is go back to the idea of Pangea, and Pangea separated, right? And when it separated, those land masses became the prototypes for subsequent land masses that got names such as Australia and Europe and Asia and so forth. So these guys in this group, they evolved on a landmass which at the time were essentially islands that broke off from Pangea. Ultimately, they formed the landmass that became Europe, right? Now, of course, they're not strictly staying in Europe. A lot of them, their ancestors migrated back into Asia and Africa and so forth. You see primates on the list. Primates we think of as being African. They're not Afrotherian because they didn't first evolve the continent of Africa. So here's another fun word, Laurasiatherian. So you kind of see the word Asia in there. You see the word mammals again. However, Laurasia, that's another one of these early land masses that developed from Pangea, right? That was the name of the supercontinent right after Pangea started breaking up. So these guys here, that's your rodents, your rabbits, your tree shrews, your primates. These guys here, that's a true type of shrew. It's your hooved animals. Hooved animals gave rise to cetaceans, so that's your bats, your whales. Your bats are in that group as well. So I just put this here as a point of interest. This was kind of the traditional way to classify animals, and it was done so strictly on their appearance. This is a morphological traditional classification. This is now the modern, so this reflects back to the prior slide. It's the same groups. You see the same names down along here, right? So it's a much more accurate phylogeny based on actual evolutionary relationships. Although you still see the dotted lines, you might recall from Unit 1 that dotted lines in cladograms are still not fully resolved. So this is still considered a hypothesis, right? But, you know, it's always a work in progress. We've gone from the traditional morphological groupings to our evolutionary phylogenies. And, you know, we have some pretty good information based on the DNA and geological evidence as to the type of land masses that these different creatures came from. So this is just a very brief survey of some of those major groups and some of the main characteristics. Your monotremes, that's your platypus, your echidnas. So kind of weird, right? They lay eggs. They have no nipples. The young suck the milk off of the fur. The fur is, the milk is secreted by the mammary glands right onto the fur. And the young just kind of lap up the milk leaking out into the fur. Your marsupials, so they're the ones that complete the embryonic development in the marsupium, the pouch. So these are your Afrotherians, right? They originated in Africa, and that's not to say that they stayed in Africa, because you see some of these creatures all around the world. Well, you don't see elephants all over the place, but you do see manatees in North America, for example. Proboscis, that means nose. So your elephants, of course, have the trunk, tusks. Your manatees, they live in the water, right? They're the subject of a commercial that's been going around, but you can see these in aquariums and so forth. Your aardvarks, so this means tube mouth, so they have teeth that are very thin tubes cemented together, and they're good at eating ants and termites. This is an African creature, and it's a very close relative of the manatee and the elephant. They look almost like a gopher, so it's kind of strange to think of these guys all being so closely related, but they are. Remember, this is the American group, so that's your sloths, anteaters, armadillos, and actually, case of reverse evolution in some instances, highly reduced or even no teeth. Sloths kind of crawl along eating leaves and stuff. Anteaters, of course, are carnivorous, eating ants, right? This word here means rabbits or rabbit-like creatures. So you know all about rabbits. Hop around, herbivorous, pretty strong incisors. Rodents, of course, rodentia, so their teeth are also chisel-like, but they have to always chew on something because they constantly grow. So your squirrels, beavers, rats, mice, porcupines, they have to wear those teeth down by always chomping away at something. I got these darn squirrels that are always chewing on my gutters. They like to chew the metal gutters. Makes a lot of noise. So you know all about primates, right? Lemurs, monkeys, chimps, gorillas, humans. It's interesting, carnivora is the name of an order, but a lot of creatures are carnivores that don't have to be in this group, but that's just another example of sometimes the names aren't necessarily the greatest names in the world. So your carnivora, well, you know what they like to do, right? Sharp-pointed canine teeth, molars for shearing. They're carnivorous. Dogs, wolves, bears, cats, weasels, otters, seals, walruses. This is an interesting group. These are your hooved animals. And some of these guys are ancestral to cetaceans. Remember we talked once about Pakicetus, the Pakistan whale. Well, that was a land animal that didn't look a whole lot different from ancestor to sheep, right? So the artiodactyls, they have hooves. They're herbivorous, whereas their descendants, the whales, dolphins, and porpoises, they're streamlined for swimming, right? Whereas some creatures have an even number of toes, some creatures have an odd number of toes in their hooves. That's like your horses, zebras, tapirs, rhinos. There you see the word wing again, so that's your bats. Insectivores, so that's things that are good at eating insects. That's like moles and certain shrews. Alright, so we can wrap it up with a picture of a porcupine. That's quite a fascinating mammal. They have hairs that are adapted into quills, which is clearly a defense mechanism. There's African and American porcupines. The American porcupine, they have little barbs at the end, like a fish hook. So if something wants to go take a bite out of this guy, it quickly learns that it shouldn't because the quill sticks in it and it doesn't come back out again so easily because the barb tears at the flesh. I guess maybe you'd rather get stuck by a African porcupine because they're not barbed. Still pretty painful, I suspect. All right, so we can do a concept check. We can do a quiz. And since that's it for the unit, we can also do the unit 4 exam.